It's the 18th episode of the Albums Only podcast. My name is Alan Beavers. Alongside me, Jacob Slater. And today we're going to talk about Echo and the Bunnymen, better known as Ian McCulloch, Noel Burke, Will Sergeant, Les Pattinson, Guy Pratt, Alex Germans, Peter Wilkinson, Pete DeFreitas, Damon Reese, Michael Lee, Vinnie Jameson, and Simon Findley, all in some form or fashion were members of the band for one period or another. Primarily Ian McCulloch and Will Sergeant are the primary members to this day of the group. We want to talk about the album Ocean Rain. We're going to have a lot of fun doing that. This is a really interesting album. Reminds me a bit, Jacob, of Scott Walker in a lot of ways, just because the instrumentation and the strings and sort of the theatrical aspect of it. We'll get into the album in a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit about sort of the foundation of the band. But one of the questions we always start off with first, Jacob, I'm really interested, when did you first hear Echo and the Bunnymen, and what were your thoughts on that sound?
Well, I think the first time I became aware of them was, I believe, in college. There was a little store that I would used to go to during like my first year, and they would sell a good variety of magazines. You had the Rolling Stones, Wired, a lot of that stuff. And I believe there was an interview with Ian McCulloch in one of the magazines I had bought. I never really heard of Echo and the Bunnymen. Maybe a little bit in passing, but they weren't a name that I really recognized. Well, even that same magazine, I actually discovered Prefab Sprout as well, which has become one of my favorite kind of 80s UK bands. But Echo and the Bunnymen is a similar case to Susie and the Banshees, where I was aware of them in college. I played them a couple times during my term there. I don't know, they kind of eluded me in some ways. Very interesting stuff, though. And this kind of comes back to something that I've been meaning to talk to you about since before we started this episode. On the Wikipedia page for Ocean Rain, it mentions neo-psychedelica as the genre that this album is based on. And we talked a little about psychedelic music last episode with Dr. Octagon. And you mentioned that you didn't feel that Octagon Ecologist was a psychedelic album. So I wanted to ask you, Beeves, what you thought was psychedelic music, what you considered psychedelic as a genre, and if you really see any major differences between psychedelic music and neo-psychedelica.
That's a really good question. I'll be honest with you. I don't know that I know enough to be able to tell you the difference between psychedelic music and neo-psychedelic music. I don't know that I personally know the difference. I mean, I would imagine that something like Jefferson Aeroplane's Surrealistic Pillow would be psychedelia. And then things that come sort of after that particular period in history, would qualify as the neo brand of that. Again, I don't really have a good history of that. I don't really consider this album, Ocean Rain, psychedelic music. I personally don't. I kind of see it as this melding of new wave and post-punk. I think the strings in it and sort of the orchestration, it makes it really unique, and to me makes it really sound Scott Walker-esque. After listening to a lot of Scott Walker recently, I was just struck by that. That just sort of jumped out at me, how much that was the case. We're going to talk about a band before too long called Secret Oyster, and I found what they produce to be psychedelia. To me, that's what comes to mind. I personally have a hard time viewing it that way, but that's my personal view of it. What are your thoughts sort of on that label and everything else that comes along with it?
I find it kind of weird that we even label it neo-psychedelia, honestly, because it seems to me that we've never had a period of time when psychedelic music ceased. Maybe a little bit in like the late 70s or something, or the mid 70s. But it seems like ever since the 1960s, this tone that we associate with psychedelia, the trippy musical experimentations, the focus on solos and imbibing you with this trance-like state, it hasn't really left since the late 1960s. I mean, you had like Big Star and stuff doing power pop and Electric Light Orchestra in the early 70s, and then in the late 70s you had groups like the Soft Boys and Robin Hitchcock. So I don't feel like we've ever had enough of a break between periods so we could really label something as psychedelia and neo-psychedelia. And then, you know, the psychedelic revivals and garage rock revivals that we've had in recent years. Just one long continuous string of music that gives the impression of a trance-like state or a dream-like state. And I know you don't feel like this is a kind of a psychedelic album. Honestly, I've definitely found like a lot of elements that reminded me of people trying to capture that late 60s sound, like the garage rock and stuff like that. It's probably, and reading over their kind of a background over this piece, it's definitely not as strong in that way as Echo and the Bunnymen's previous work had been. It seems like, and I haven't listened to much of their earlier stuff, but it definitely seemed like this was the album where they were kind of breaking away from those strong roots in garage rock.
I agree with you. Having heard some of their earlier stuff, I agree with you that this is decidedly different. I think it's this sort of orchestral, the strings, everything else that goes on here. It's the orchestra that sort of makes this so different to me. There's a lot of care in this album. Compared to their earlier stuff, it really is sort of that post-punk. Often reminds me of The Cure, their earlier stuff. Like early Cure and early Echo are, I see a lot of parallels myself.
Can't really remember now, but you mentioned The Cure. I thought a lot of The Cure in this album as well. To me personally, I also saw a lot of U2.
Wow, okay.
Especially on this like first song that we're going to be talking about. I got like a very strong, Ian McCulloch and Bono have like a very similar way of singing.
Oh, great. We'll get to that in just a second. I'm curious now. My curiosity is piqued. So let me give a little background on Echo and the Bunnymen and talk a little bit about some of their other works, and then we'll get into the album proper. Echo and the Bunnymen formed in 1978 after Ian McCulloch was kicked out of a band in which he was a member with Julian Cope. And if you're not familiar with Julian Cope, a pretty popular sort of underground figure. So it's interesting to imagine the two of them together, two people with such talent together.
Julian Cope, also one of the kind of big neo-psychedelia musicians, I feel, in the 1980s. If you ever heard like The Teardrop Explodes, is very much trying to capture that 60s sound.
That's absolutely true. So what happened was, after Cope kicked McCulloch out of the band they were in together, Cope went ahead and formed The Teardrop Explodes. Interesting, fascinating story. The first gig Echo and the Bunnymen had was to open for The Teardrop Explodes. So he opened for the band that he was more or less kicked out of. And the first time they ever performed, the Echo and the Bunnymen performed, they did a 20-minute version of Monkeys, which was entitled I Bagsy Yours. And so that was that was their first performance. Needless to say, they probably improved greatly after that. They had their debut album, 1980's Crocodiles, 1981's Heaven Up Here, which has an excellent track on it called A Promise. I like that one a lot. That's probably my favorite song that doesn't appear on Ocean Rain. It's a great ringing song. It works really well. They went on after that, of course, and they released Ocean Rain in 1984. In 83, they had an album called Porcupine. In 87, they came back after a little hiatus and had their eponymous release. And then the band itself actually went through several changes. They split in 1988. They reformed and later. So there's a lot of things that sort of changed for them. After they reformed in the mid-90s, they went on to release several more albums. But really the bulk of their greatest work is in the 80s, the early to mid 80s, and Ocean Rain as an example. 1984 is one we really want to talk about. Another thing that I want to mention is that one of the things we haven't talked about, but I think is a great idea, when you talk about these proto-punk bands, when you talk about sort of new wave, when you talk about these really instrumental bands like Echo and the Bunnymen, like the Smiths, like so many others, you can find some of their best work in compilations. And that's sort of frowned upon. Depeche Mode, another example of this, when catching up with the Depeche Mode, the Smiths, and Hatful of Hollow. There are compilations of certain bands whose earlier singles and works are kind of scattered or hard to come by. And if you really want to check out a great summary of Echo and the Bunnymen, I highly suggest that you check out Songs to Sing and Learn, Learn and Sing. Songs to Learn and Sing. I think that is a wonderful album, great compilation that has a lot of the great stuff on it, up through Ocean Rain. So let's actually talk about 1984's Ocean Rain itself. Jacob, any other thoughts before we move on here to Ocean Rain?
I can't think of anything.
Okay, great. So let's start into it, because I'm curious to hear what you have to say about the first song on this album, Silver. It was actually released as a single. I think it's really good. I also believe that Silver is on the comp Songs to Learn and Sing as well. Your thoughts on the album? Or excuse me, your thoughts on the song. My apologies.
Yeah, this is just a great opener, at least in my opinion. Very garage rocky, with a touch of that kind of Eastern scale, I believe they refer to it. That kind of feel that brings to mind images of India, Southeast Asia, and all those kinds of weird psychedelic bands. But at the same time, even though you have like this garage rock bass, it is then accented by a 35-piece orchestra, which I thought was very interesting, honestly. One of the main things that I was kind of surprised about looking into the history of this album was how divisive it was.
Yeah, that's a great point. Please do tell us a little bit of that historiography.
Well, according to the history of the band, the band's previous album, Porcupines, which was released a year prior, apparently had not sold as well as to be expected. So the group decided to, on their next album, kind of change things up a bit. And one of the big changes was to introduce orchestral arrangements, including a 35-piece orchestra. I believe several other members of the band contributed like glockenspiels and stuff like that to kind of increase the range of sound that you hear on the album. Songs written in 1983 and recorded at Studio des Dames and Studio Davos in Paris and Bath in Liverpool. And apparently, according to kind of the legacy of the album, it was met with mixed reviews, actually. Rolling Stone described the album as too often a monochromatic dirge of banal existential imagery cloaked around the mere skeleton of a musical idea, which I believe, using $5 words, he's averaged out to $35.
To match the orchestra, you have to have $1 for every musician in the orchestra.
And in NME, Ocean Rain has been designed to buttress the notion of the group's importance. Not unnaturally, the results have the opposite effect.
Can I just want to throw something out there for you? Let me, actually, you know what, I'm going to let you finish, but then we have to talk about the magazine Rolling Stone. This is an aside that I really want to get out of my system. So I'll have you finish, but then perhaps I'll rant a bit.
Well, it just struck me as kind of surprising that this kind of melding of orchestral instrumentation with the band's psychedelic or garage rocky or neo-psychedelia sound was treated with such animosity. I mean, considering how many bands in the 1980s incorporated orchestral music into their sound. We just talked about an album a few episodes back that did just that, Through the Looking Glass by Susie and the Banshees. Hard orchestral arrangements in that music. I believe The Cure did very much the same thing. So it's weird to me that apparently this was the breaking point for people with Echo and the Bunnymen, that the orchestral arrangements apparently made things too, I don't even know what the word would be.
Too impressionistic or...
Yeah. Melodramatic in a lot of ways.
Yes, that's a great way to put it.
When considering how much that idea was kind of prevalent in post-punk and goth rock music, it just really surprised me.
I'm struck by, if you ever look at Rolling Stone magazine, they are very bad at being able to judge albums that will be considered classics ahead of time. They're terrible at it. Go back and look at the Pixies albums or any album that was new, any sound that was new. You're going to have a hard time seeing that Rolling Stone's going to give anything like that a great review. They're generally mediocre, like, this is promising. However, if you're the Rolling Stones or you're Bob Dylan or you're U2, you're going to get a very good, very, well-starred review no matter what. No matter what you put out, it's going to get 4 out of 5 stars or better. It's just fascinating to me. You look back at all the sort of the mediocre Bob Dylan albums and Rolling Stone albums and other albums, you look back at those, and if you look at what the original view is in Rolling Stone, it's some of the most positive reviews the album gets from anywhere. So Rolling Stone has a very terrible record of understanding what good music is at the time. Sorry, Rolling Stone, but that's just generally the truth. I think it's later in, when they do their revised, record album review compendiums that they always revise upward so many things.
I mean, if I had read this page prior to picking the album, I might have suggested it be part of the Rehab tour, just because it was so divisive. But I had always thought that this was the Echo and the Bunnymen record.
Right. Well, I think it's definitely had a revision upward. I mean, we've talked about the historiography of certain albums before. This one definitely is part of that. I mentioned Rolling Stone gave it 2 out of 5 stars the first time through. On the Rolling Stone album guide, though, a later compendium, it's got 3.5 magically. So, and again, I get it. Different people review things, but it's still, you sort of see that revision. You look here, allmusic.com has it at 5 out of 5. Blender Magazine gave it 4 out of 5. The Guardian gives it 4 out of 5. So, yeah, this is generally a well-thought-of album for its time, and now it is. And it's also generally considered their best. I think some people like Heaven Up Here, some people like Porcupine, but I think the biggest consensus would be this album now, at least. So,
going back to Silver, really love this track. It's really rocky, really kind of a swirling psychedelic garage rock song, at least in my opinion, especially with that kind of string accompaniment. And personally, I feel like Ian McCulloch pretty much is doing a really good Bono impression.
That's interesting. You know what, too? There's an onomatopoeia part there, that la 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 kind of part comes in. And that really actually makes the song more mainstream in a lot of ways.
And I don't know what the song is really about. I feel like one of the main criticisms of this album was Ian McCulloch is just kind of he's saying things that don't really make sense.
That's a very Bono-like trait, isn't it?
Yeah, that's very true. Just singing things that sound good but don't really make sense.
With burning lips, you're living proof at my fingertips. That sounds like Bono. I buy that.
And the way Ian McCulloch kind of drags that out too. I really do like a lot of what Ian McCulloch does vocally on this album. I think even if his songs, the clearest thing, they're not Leonard Cohen material, I think he performs them very well. It really gets you into the music. We're starting off on a good foot because Silver is already one of my favorite tracks on this album.
So the next track is Nocturnal Me. I don't know how I feel about this one. I like it, and I think it's somewhat sexy in a way. I mean, the line, "Oh, take me internally, forever yours, nocturnal me," that little triplet there works really nicely. And sort of, too, there is this sort of dark dusk. I can imagine, like a castle against a night backdrop while the song plays and curtains flowing, and it works very well in that way. Your thoughts, Jacob?
Yeah, very kind of acoustic-based song, I feel. You got like the acoustic guitar that opens. You got the strings. Reminds me, I put down here like Romani folk music, like gypsy folk music. I feel like there's a very strong Eastern European vibe to it. But this is very interesting because Silver was a very kind of upbeat rock track, and Nocturnal Me is a very gloomy song. It is still very driving, but it's also has a very, very dark tone to it, which I really liked it, actually. I thought it was really interesting. I believe on the Wikipedia page it mentions that this song was featured in Stranger Things. So if you're a big fan of the Stranger Things, then I am, actually, very much so.
In the first season of Stranger Things, the 5th episode featured Nocturnal Me in the end credits.
Yeah. I wonder if when I watched that episode I recognized that it was Echo and the Bunnymen. Because I don't know if I did or not. But that's actually an interesting little tidbit. I want to revisit that episode now. Kind of see how they incorporate it.
So that leads us into Crystal Days, the third track. This is a rather quick one, just under 2.5 minutes. I actually like this one quite a bit. It actually reminds me of A Promise a bit. There's something about this sort of guitar riff that they have going on there that brings... It sounds familiar. It sounds like you've heard this song before. I think the orchestral touches really make it. Jacob, do you have any other thoughts on this one?
It's weird because this is a track that I really liked, but I'm having trouble kind of remembering what it sounded like musically. It was very much a return to the guitar-driven kind of rock music that we heard in Silver. I can't remember. I do remember, at least, that I really like how the strings and the orchestra accompany this piece. I remember it really being very good. I'm not sure what Crystal Days are. I don't know how Ian McCulloch plans to magnify them or what purifying our misfit ways really means, but I believe it's about love.
That's the go-to. That's a very safe go-to.
It's very much either love or death. It's been it for several albums so far. I'm just going to throw it out here now and hope it sticks. But I did enjoy the song. I just can't remember much about it at this moment.
The fourth track is The Yo-Yo Man. I like the impressionistic feel of this song. It's a really dark song. It reminds me of Nocturnal Me in a way. I almost wish those two tracks would have flowed into each other. When I first heard this song, I just wasn't a big fan of it, but I feel like Nocturnal Me and The Yo-Yo Man, if you throw those together, that pastiche they create is very dark, and the wonderful use of strings again. The violin just brings it out nicely. That darkness, that sort of sinister touch that creeps in there. I like it the more I listen to it. I have more respect for the song. Probably heard it 4 or 5 times. Each time that I heard it, I gained a new respect for it. I like it a lot. I'm starting to really... By the time I was done listening to this album, I really started to enjoy and notice the sort of dark overtones that come through, and particularly on this song.
Yeah. It's very interesting. It's a very kind of swaying song. I likened it to a sea shanty, actually, because it has this kind of rocking back and forth motion. Perhaps like a yo-yo. It's another one of those gloomy songs that seems to take place after a rocking song. I really like how it's almost like a violent attack on the song. They're very kind of violently thrust into this song. I find it hard to kind of explain it because it has a very kind of weird sound to it. A bit like a sea shanty, a little bit, but at the same time very gloomy, very kind of Tim Burton-esque, I guess, is what kind of comes to my mind.
The next track, Crown of Thorns, continues that sort of gloomy, tattered kind of sound, you would call it. On this one, we really hear McCulloch's vocals. He has a lot of fun with these, because I can now see your Bono come through a little more when I think about Thorn of Crowns. I really hear Bono now that you mention it. You put an idea in my head and it's sticking. This song, this is another one, like, I like the impression it gives. When you listen to this song intently, you don't really know what to think of it. But if you sort of let this song flow in the background, it jumps out to you really nicely. Because there's a lot of variation, there's a lot of dynamic in this song. And it goes a bunch of different places. There are parts where there's some nice guitar licks coming out at you. I like this song, but I also only like it as a mood piece. I'm kind of all over on this one.
You know, it really kind of annoys me that I keep seeing the name Thorn of Crowns and think, yeah, that makes sense. When it's actually supposed to be Crown of Thorns, and I always keep forgetting, Thorn of Crowns doesn't make sense, Ian McCulloch. You're confusing me. Every time I think, yeah, that sounds right, but no, it doesn't. I really like this song. It's probably it's very true to the form of psychedelic music, where it is about expressing a mood and kind of about the freak out, I suppose. Starts off, I had it listed as like a surf rock rumba in some way.
That's what I mean. It's all over the place.
Yeah, with a really fantastic bass line. Probably like my favorite bass line of the record.
Well, and the dynamics, too. I mean, at one point, a little after halfway through, it completely stops, and then it's just McCulloch, just emoting all over the place, and then builds back up again. It's sort of the centerpiece here, and I say that in knowing full well what song was coming next, but in a way, it's sort of the emotional centerpiece.
Yeah, it builds you up to a fever pitch, and then just explodes, and then kind of drops back. Just like this constant cycle of explosion and implosion, which I really like. It's very kind of really gets you amped up. Reminds me a little bit in tone of Kick Inside of Me by Simple Minds off of Rain on the Waterfront or something like that. Very good record despite me not remembering what it's called. I mean, I really like the line, "You are a dying breed, you are a dying breed. You once was an Inca, now you're a Cherokee." Like that's pretty much the tone of the lyrics on here. Ian McCulloch's very in the mood to groove here. But I just like that line because he's repeating, "You are a dying breed." Like he's repeating the line twice, and then by the kind of the response line, he's naming off two dying breeds. It's clever, trust me. Just because I can't explain it very well, but yeah, Thorn of Crowns is very much like a mood piece, and I think I like that about the song.
I liked it more as I got to listen to it. I will say that the more I listened to it, the more I liked it, the more I appreciated it, really. So let's move on to what you're gonna have a hard time arguing isn't the greatest song Echo and the Bunnymen have ever done, and obviously their most popular song. The chords of the song are actually based on David Bowie's Space Odyssey played backwards, which is kind of fascinating to think about. This is a song that Ian McCulloch said, "I love the song all the more because I didn't pore over it for days on end. One morning, I just sat bolt upright in bed with this line in my head. Fate, up against your will, through the thick and thin, he will wait until you give yourself to him. You don't dream things like that and remember them. That's why I always half credit the lyric to God." So, The Killing Moon, and you can hear this song everywhere. This has been featured in Rock Band 3. This has been featured on a commercial, heaven help me, I can't remember the car company, during the Super Bowl. I remember that very vividly. This is a Stone Cold classic. It's the song they'll never escape, and they should never have to because it's an amazing song. The Killing Moon, this is the sweeping sound, that line, those lines, fade up against your will. It's just repeated constantly. It works so well. This is the song. I mean, this is the song they'll always be remembered for.
Yeah, and for good reason, because it's definitely, I would say, one of the stronger songs on the album, if not the strongest song, in terms of like the music, which is kind of like this new wave Western in a lot of ways. It has like those shimmering guitars you always associate with Ennio Morricone, and just like the strings work so well. You're just like, it brings you into this great gloomy mood. The lyrics, as opposed to Thorn of Crowns, are very concise. A song about death, just as Crystal Days is a song about love. And it's beautifully written, I think. It really kind of captures this romanticist, surrealist kind of viewpoint.
By the way, the single of this song is awesome. You should go check out, if you get a chance, Google Echo and the Bunnymen, The Killing Moon single. It's a perfect description of what the song sounds like. I mean, it's got the moon sort of against sort of the sea and rocks off to the side. It's perfect. That's exactly what this reminds me of. Where it's perfect visualization.
Yeah, it was the most successful single on the record as well. Released on January 20th, reached number 9 on the UK singles charts and number 7 on the Irish singles charts, which, as we all know, is the most important chart to be on. The Irish really know their music. The next track, it was also released as a single, actually, on July 6th. And I'm talking of 7 Seas, which reached number 16 on the chart, and number 10 on the Irish chart. 7 Seas is, unless you count my vision of the Yo-Yo Man as like a sea shanty, it's the first song that kind of hits the concept of the album, of a kind of watery, maritime-based song, which I believe was kind of the impetus for naming it Ocean Rain, and kind of the album cover as well was to kind of capture an elemental theme, which I thought was kind of interesting. It's not something you'd really think about, I think, when you're buying the record. Like, oh, this is the water album, just like the other one was the snow album, or the air album. But 7 Seas is, it's another song that I really liked, actually. It's another song with a really amazing bass line.
Great bass line, good guitar. I mean, I really enjoy the melody on the guitar there. It works really well. And I also love the fact that there's this, towards the end of the chorus, there's the repetition of the line, kissing the tortoise shell, but it really sounds like he's saying kissing the tortoise shell, which I don't know why I like repeating that over and over, but you feel so weird when you're saying it. But man, it feels so good for whatever reason.
Yeah, very kind of weird. And you'll strike the matches and shower me in water games, which I guess you could take it different ways nowadays. The word water games brings up some unfortunate connotations, but it's a really good song, actually. Very kind of garagey, I think. I don't know. Listening over this record, I'm not really seeing any point where the use of the orchestral arrangements brings down the song. Is that the same for you?
Yeah, I agree completely. In many ways, it makes it to me. Because without it, you... I don't want to say you sound like everyone else, because Echo and the Bunnymen doesn't sound just like everyone else, but there is a certain sameness that one could argue comes through in a lot of that post-punk, new wave kind of thing that went on around this time with Echo, with The Cure, with those kind of bands. I would be afraid that it would sound too much like those. I'm sure it would still be a solid album, I'm sure, but that's what makes it here. All that orchestral flourishing takes it to a new level. That's the most important point.
I feel like even like on their rockier songs, like their most solid kind of, perhaps more akin to their previous work songs, like perhaps Silver or Crystal Days, there's never been a moment when I've been listening to these songs and think, well, they didn't really need like those violins, or they didn't really need this kind of orchestral stuff. To me, and this is like a modern guy, and maybe not someone who was in the thick of it in the 1980s, there's never a moment where it's like, you didn't really need it. It's always adds a texture and a layer onto these these songs that I think heightens them. And you could say it's too overly dramatic or too like overly emotional, but it works. I think I can't really say there was ever a moment where I was like, no.
Fascinating note. One of the producers of the album was Gil Norton, who also worked with the Pixies, a well-respected producer. I just happened to notice that. I really like his work, and I think maybe that's a great reflection on the album as well. Move on to My Kingdom. This is another track that sort of fits in with that, with some of the other tracks here in terms of it. You can see it easily being a post-punk song. And again, the flourishes really help make it. Another thing that you hear on this track for really the first time in the album that I can think of is there's a really fuzzy guitar sort of solo that they put throughout this, and I really don't remember that particular sound being anywhere else on the album. It's really the most indulgent that they get with the guitars and sort of the traditional rock and roll sense.
Yeah, My Kingdom is a song that, thinking about it, I'm finding it kind of hard to explain just what it sounds like, because there's this great combination of like driving drums and acoustic guitar with like this like underlying bass that kind of thumps along to it. But it's not just that. It's done in such a way that sounds incredibly strange. And it's a very interesting song. I actually really enjoyed it. In my notes, I made allusions to both U2 and Bauhaus, which, kind of Bono in the high moments and Peter Murphy on the low moments, I guess you could say, or the kind of more talk-based lines. We already said gloomy. I think this is one where it's like straight up dark in terms of the lyrics. Just the chorus is burn the skin off and climb the rooftop, thy will be done, bite the nose off and make it the most of your kingdom.
That's interesting. That the music doesn't really reflect that, in my opinion.
It's a very kind of epic, sweeping song. But even like at the very end, when like the music is playing, you can hear like Ian McCulloch kind of doing a little vocal stuff. And at the end it says, you're a bitter, malignant person and the death is well overdue. You suck the blood that kills you. You kiss the hand that hates you. You're a bitter, malignant person and your death is well overdue. You're sucking bitter pain.
Mr. Grinch. No.
Yeah. It's very oddly dark, and yet at the same time, it doesn't really make sense.
And it's not... I feel it's an upbeat song. Like, I feel it's one of the more upbeat, sort of, like you said, driving songs on the album. So, yeah, it's an interesting juxtaposition there. We move on to the final track, the title track, Ocean Rain. I'll be honest with you, this is one where the orchestral accompaniment is very much at the forefront here. I'm going to say this is my least favorite track on the album. I just don't find anything too special about this. Now, it's clear that it should be the closer, just sort of the slow pace that sort of moves forward. If you just listen to this song, maybe you'd have a valid point. That negative review from Rolling Stone might have a bit of validity. Because this track, I don't find to be that interesting to me. And I can see where that criticism about the languid pace of the song could be correct. That being said, it still fits in with the album. I think it's the obvious closer. Maybe you have more of an affectation towards it. What are your thoughts, Jacob?
Yeah, I think I have a little bit better opinion, or not better, more favorable opinion about the song. I think it really does well capturing this kind of beautiful, sweeping mood. But you're right at the same time that it is definitely a closer of a song, because it doesn't really fit anywhere else, in my opinion. It's the only song on the record that's a kind of just straight ballad. All the other songs, even the gloomier songs, are much more upbeat and active and rockier as compared to this song, where the orchestra really is the forefront. I can definitely see where the argument could be made based on that song that things were going a little bit too orchestral, I guess, too melodramatic, where there's just a lot of emotions flying around, but not not a lot of substance. I don't know. I think as kind of a closer, it works. Capturing the essence of what the album was, it works. In some ways, I think it really does a good job at kind of closing the book on Echo and the Bunnymen, because a lot of people say this is kind of like the moment before things kind of started to break up. I guess this is kind of the last kind of solid work by them before, the hiatus happened and the other albums that weren't really as well received. A lot of 80s kind of post-punk and new wave bands kind of dealt with was kind of life after the 80s and kind of life after new wave. It's not one of my favorite songs on the record, but I like it as kind of the solemn closer, and I think it really captures in this song. It captures what the album is. It's the title track for a reason.
So that closes the book on Echo and the Bunnymen and Ocean Rain, a very important post-punk band in the 1980s, along with so many others. We haven't talked about the Smiths, and we haven't talked about The Cure, and we haven't talked about Depeche Mode.
And we never will. Sorry, 80s
Never.
fans.
You're in trouble. No, given how much we both love the 80s and the bands that are prevalent there, they will not be far off, I'm sure. Jacob, this was a good episode. I really enjoyed it, actually.
Yeah, very interesting, because it was a band I'd always known, but had never sat down and listened to.
Thank you for forcing me to put my earbuds in.
Yeah.
And truly...
I'm really holding you at gunpoint here, Beeves.
Right, exactly. Well, I'm thinking, though, that the random generator we use should be thanked for this. So... Thank you, random generator gods.
Well, and another little fun fact, this album was released in 1984, the same year as Madonna's Like a Virgin, which we covered a few episodes back. So in the 80s, this was like the stuff that you had to choose from, I guess, was Like a Virgin, Ocean Rain, Cyndi Lauper's She's So Unusual. It kind of paints a very interesting picture of, like, the time. That's something we don't usually think about. At least I don't really think about it too often, is what it would have been like to have lived in the time of all these bands. Like, what it would have been like to have lived in, like, San Francisco or Los Angeles in 1968, when all these amazing, psychedelic and acid rock bands and garage rock bands, like, what did the people of the 60s listen to, and what was, like, their kind of, what were they drawn to? What did they think was a monochromatic dirge of banal existential imagery cloaked around the skeleton of a musical idea? What was the Ocean Rain of that time?
Could you imagine someone then telling you that, just saying, well, I think it's banal pastiche. Like, I'm not going to listen to you.
I'm not going to throw shade on anybody, but I have worked with people in U92 who were just like that.
Let's be honest, it's important to be able to use your vocabulary to the best of your ability and to have a wide-ranging one where you fully understand a lot of terms and are able to paint a picture. That's something that I'm envious of. But sometimes you have to be deft at how you do it, and that might be a little too wordy.
Yeah. Great album, really great band. Makes me want to kind of look back on their more rockier stuff, see like what the discrepancy was.
Yeah, might I recommend you should check out I Promise. That is a good track. I like that one quite a bit.
Thanks everyone for listening. Next week we are covering one of my favorite bands, one of my favorite artists as well, frequent Frank Zappa collaborator Captain Beefheart, a.k.a. Don Van Valet, and his Magic Band, with an album that I hadn't had a chance to listen to, even though I was a huge fan. It's the 1970 album Lick My Decals Off, Baby, released a year after the infamous Trout Mask replica. And there's a lot of stuff in there that sounds very similar to that, so should be a very interesting episode.
I'm looking forward to that. We're going to have a lot of fun with Captain Beefheart, especially since going back and listening to his stuff, it's amazing how much different styles he covered. So we're going to have a lot of fun doing that. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Reminder, you can follow us on Twitter at albumsonly. You can also email us at the albumsonlypodcast@gmail.com. We'll see you next time.